Hello, everyone. A very pleasant and happy Saturday to you. My name is David Defoe, and I want to welcome you to another one of our relationship ministry seminars. Listen, this time is going to go by really quickly, and so I'm just going to bring on our panel at this moment and then come on and introduce them. Today, we're going to be talking about this very important issue, Black family trauma. What is the linkages between historical trauma and our present pain? And so right before we begin, let me just introduce our panelists to you so you get to know them, and then we'll get right into this discussion this morning. The first person I want to introduce to you is Dr. Beverly Gordon. Dr. Gordon earned her doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the Immaculata University, her master's degree in counseling psychology also from Immaculata, and her bachelor's degree in nursing education from Northern Caribbean University. Her professional experience covers 40 years in healthcare healthcare, and 12 years in higher education. She's an active member in professional organizations such as the American Educational Research Association, Association for Psychological Science, American Psychological Association, and the American Association of Christian Counselors. Dr. Gordon's flexibility and wide range of interest have allowed her to move comfortably and effectively in a variety of settings, and this has served to enrich her understanding and appreciation for the human experience. She's a committed Christian with a passion for fostering human relationships, and she candidly admits to a lifelong Christian philosophy that guides her work and also her values. In a couple minutes, we'll give her a couple of seconds to introduce herself in a more in-depth way to you. The next person I want to bring on is Dr. H. Gene Wright II. Dr. Wright is a transformational and highly experienced and professionally trained clinical and forensic psychologist with over 20 years of experience in behavioral health and proven success in passionately leading people and managing projects and initiatives in government, in private practice, in academia, as an associate professor in clinical faculty for Temple University, and in rehabilitation and correction. As a clinical consultant, facilitator, and trainer, Dr. Wright teaches the subtleties of human interaction to successfully embrace and celebrate the variety of personalities in the workplace and in the community. His extensive research in human behavior and skill in delivering mission-critical results in direct clinical care, supervision, and management have contributed to his success in contributing as a subject matter expert for media such as WDDS in Philadelphia, where he's a regular contributor on Headlines with Frankie Darcell. Dr. Wright recently completed his book, Find Strength in Your Struggle, Discover the Miracle in You, which highlights his concept of spiritual depression and how it impacts the social core of people from all walks of life. I'm very glad to have Dr. Wright with us. Let me introduce to you all Pastor Nathaniel Drew. Pastor Nathaniel Drew pastors the Temple of Praise SDA Church in Cleveland, Ohio. And along with pastoring, he's an author and a marriage and family therapist. He currently has a master's in marriage and family therapy, as well as a master's in divinity. His two greatest accomplishments were marrying his wife, Lillian, and the birth of their daughter, Lanaya Joy. Nathaniel loves God, and even more, he loves people. This next panelist is not a stranger to our relationship ministries department. She's been with us many times before, but not in this capacity before. But Dr. Tiffany Llewelyn is a migrant of Trinidad and Tobago. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and Tiffany has extensive experience working within the mental health field and is passionate about destigmatizing mental health and teaching on racialized trauma. She served at various levels of church leadership and is the president and founder of the faith-based organization Adventists for Social Justice. Dr. Llewelyn recently launched a YouTube channel series called Starting From Series, and this series is intended to help Christian singles reframe, reimagine, and restore fun in Christian dating. Listen, I want to welcome you all to this panel. I have been looking forward to this and have been excited about what it is that you all will share. And so we're just going to jump right in. If you're watching with us, by all means, if you have anything to share, by all means, put it into the comment box. And why don't you share this with someone who may need to engage in this conversation? Listen, it's going to be a wonderful, freeing, enlightening discussion. And I just want to turn it over to you all. And just really quick, just tell us a little bit something about you that wasn't in your bio, and then tell us an idea about why trauma and speaking to trauma is so important to you. Any which one of you all want to go first? Just jump right on in.
Sure, I'll jump in. I'm very, very passionate about seeing families made whole again and move to a healthier place. A lot of that stems from my own family of origin and seeing different things that have taken place in my family and how those have had adverse ripple effects that have affected not only my life in certain areas, but also the lives of my siblings, the lives of cousins, and different things like that. And so I have a burden for families in particular, as it pertains to trauma. So this topic is very near and dear to me, and I look forward to gleaning from my brothers and sisters who have so much knowledge and expertise.
Not often addressed, especially in our church congregations. And it is something that, especially when we talk about racial trauma, especially in this time that we're living in, I have seen and experienced myself the effects of racial trauma. And so I feel that it is a very relevant topic, and that one that needs to be addressed, and especially given our spiritual worldview or biblical worldview, I believe that we have resources within us that can easily address these issues.
Yeah, I can just jump in really right next. I feel incredibly passionate about this topic just when I'm on the ground and I'm in the communities, whether that's in our churches, schools, wherever we are, and seeing the effects of trauma, but particularly seeing that we haven't been given the language, much less the tools to be able to name and understand what's happening in our families and our communities. And so that's really what makes me incredibly passionate, is how do we equip people with the language and understanding so that we can change our circumstances. So that's just a bit about what makes me passionate about this work.
Yes, I agree with my fellow panelists. And what I would say is that I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and most of that work has been with looking at the impact of trauma in communities of color, specifically boys and men of color, for all the reasons that you all have already stated. What's going on in our country right now, racialized trauma, the structural racism that goes on, the macro and microaggressions that happen on a daily basis. And then more recently, looking at the impact of trauma in communities of faith. A lot of times it's not going to be a surprise to my panelists, but a lot of times people forget or ignore on purpose the level of trauma that happens right in our church pews, right in our communities. And so I've been partnering with clergy, imams, faith leaders from many denominations for the past few years, looking at how we can support one another in our areas of expertise, so that a pastor, an imam, a clergy, a rabbi who has challenges in their congregation can reach out to a mental health professional and get some support for those individuals. And then vice versa, when I'm working with individuals who really are having difficulty connecting their faith to their everyday experience, I reach out to clergy on a regular basis and say, hey, how do we partner together? So I'm very passionate about this topic and so glad to join you.
All right, awesome. So for those people who are listening that may not have an idea about what trauma is, walk us through what trauma is, and then sort of tell us how it impacts us socially, cognitively, behaviorally, or even spiritually. Like, what is trauma?
Well, for me, a working definition, I will look at the psychological trauma, and a psychological trauma, and this is from Corbin and et al., Sandy Bloom and that group. Psychological trauma can be defined as experiences that are emotionally painful and distressing and that overwhelm an individual's capacity to cope. I think the most important part of that, though, is experiencing a situation where internal and external resources seem inadequate with the external threat. And what that ends up doing is it costs us from the standpoint of feeling powerlessness. And so the powerlessness is a major trait of psychological trauma. And that's why it's so impactful and seems invisible to many. And that's why they're not able to name it, as Dr. Tiffany said, not having the ability to, not having the language, not having the definition, but also not being able to explain how you're feeling. That's that powerlessness.
Yeah, I would chime in to what Dr. Wright has said and mentioned. There's so many, when you think about it, so many different aspects of trauma. And a lot of times we just look at as those events happening that at face value look very bad, abuse and different things like that. But even something that seems as simple or easygoing as moving from one state to another, or one country to another, environment to another, that could also have traumatic effects on someone, especially children who, develop in a community and then have to cut ties with that and move somewhere else. So I would see trauma as much like what Dr. Wright said, something that is deeply distressing, deeply disturbing, that really renders you unable to function in a healthy manner. And I think that trauma in and of itself, one of the reasons why it's so dangerous is because it has this component to it of paralysis, where even if I don't recognize what it's doing, its effects are at work in me, psychologically, experientially, the way I look at the world. And I know we'll get into some of that today as well.
Yeah, and the thing with psychological trauma is that it's invisible at times. So therefore, if someone gets a big wound from an accident, then, you see the wound, you're dressing the wound, it's visible, we take care of it. But unfortunately, sometimes we experience soul pain that is so deep that nobody really sees it on the outside, because we have developed ways of adapting so that we appear to be healthy. But in fact, those wounds are affecting the way we behave socially, in our relationships, in our mood states, in so many different areas of our lives. And that is one of the dangerous things about psychological trauma.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I would just add to that the sudden or unexpected aspect of trauma. And also can be categorized as whether we're talking about acute trauma, so that single one dangerous event that occurred, or chronic trauma, which I think really speaks to when we're looking at Black pain or historical trauma, racialized trauma, that chronic, repeated, ongoing exposure to a distressing event, or complex trauma, where we might be looking at multiple different events and exposure to those multiple layers. And I also think it's important for us to bring in vicarious trauma into the conversation, particularly around racialized trauma, when we're looking at the fact that many times the victims in the media we are not related to, we may not have ever met, but the emotional and psychological experience feels very much the same. And so the vicarious trauma that comes just by seeing or hearing stories, or for those of us who may be on the front line as therapists, as helpers, who also experience vicarious trauma in that way. And one really powerful quote that I love when talking about trauma in all these different contexts, like you mentioned, the psychological, social, spiritual, Resmaa Menakem, who wrote the book My Grandmother's Hands, a really powerful book that really details Black trauma, police white trauma. He says that trauma decontextualized looks like personality, culture, or family traits. All it needs is time. And so when we really think about trauma through those lenses, when we're looking and having this conversation about the family and really about ourselves and our communities, it's not just what we understand the definition of trauma to be, but also what does trauma even decontextualized show up as that we may not be fully aware.
Yeah, I love that book. I absolutely love that book. Dr. Wright, you wanted to jump in here?
I did. And thank you, Dr. Tiffany, for mentioning that book. I picked it up a week ago. I'm halfway through it. It is a wonderful book. I'm sorry I'm a little late to that party, but it's a wonderful book. But yeah, something that Dr. Tiffany said that I think is really important. She was mentioning the vicarious trauma. Many people have asked me, and you'll probably be able to suspect who's asking me by the question. They've asked me, what is it? Why are Black people so upset when they look at what happened with George Floyd and all that? So it wasn't anybody in our community asking me that question, clearly. And what I've responded is very similar to what Dr. Tiffany just alluded to, and that is many of us, when we were watching the knee on George Floyd's neck, saw ourselves on the ground, saw our babies, saw our sons, saw our daughters on the ground with a knee on their neck. And so the pervasiveness of experiential trauma, that vicarious that Dr. Tiffany is talking about, is real for Black people, because it doesn't have to happen to me for it to happen to me, right? I'm viewing it, I'm watching it. It is real. We've all known that it's real. You know, we've all had to talk with our sons mostly, but also our daughters, about what to do when the police pull you over. Not if they pull you over, not what to do if you encounter, when. And that is so important, what she's talking about, because I have two sons and I've had to talk with both of them, and they look at me like, yeah, Dad, okay, I got it. They think things are pretty good in America. And that scares me because I know what it feels like to be pulled over and up against the wall for no reason, you know. And so those are the kind of things, when you mentioned vicarious trauma, that just hit a nerve in me, because it brought that question to me about people don't understand why we feel the way we do about what is happening supposedly to other Black people, to people we don't know. And why should we care? Why is that a universal concern for us? You don't live in Minnesota. You don't know these people. You don't live in Milwaukee. I'm like, dude, I live in Philadelphia. Okay. All right. It doesn't matter where you go. You can be in a rural area and it may be even worse. And so having cameras and taking pictures and now we can document what's been happening to us for centuries.
So real quick, right? Because I want us to sort of walk through where racialized trauma comes from, how it enters into our psyche, and then how it's passed down transgenerationally into our dispositions, right? But I found this definition of historical trauma. I thought it was good. Historical trauma is intergenerational trauma experienced by a specific cultural group that has a history of being systematically oppressed. It is the cumulative psychological and emotional wounding across generations. Talk to me about how we have gotten here and what here looks like as far as historical and racial trauma, well, specifically with the Black family.
Mm-hmm. I can jump in. If I like that definition a lot. If I were to add to the definition specific to racial trauma, and I also like to highlight the systems again, so that we can begin to give people the language around what they might be experiencing. So we define racial trauma or race-based stress, racial battle fatigue, as the emotional, mental, or psychological distress based on negative race-related experiences. So when we look historically, we see really from, Black African peoples beginning in this country, it has already been contextualized within this larger conversation around systemic oppression, right? So from the very start, we have already been exposed to trauma. And so undoubtedly that would have been passed on when you talk about that transgenerational piece. Some symptoms to think about: hypervigilance, hyperarousal, anxiety, depression. We see Black people specifically reporting such higher levels of psychological distress, depression, anxiety, worry, fear, even sleeplessness, low sense of self, low self-esteem. So these are some of the symptoms across our families and across our communities that we have to begin thinking about and pinpointing. And I like to say it's not only what's happening to Black skin in this larger conversation around historical oppression, but what's also happening underneath Black skin. What's happening to us is systematic oppression that is increasing all those other symptoms. But even this concept of weathering that we have within the racial trauma literature that speaks to how systemic oppression, racism, is literally deteriorating Black bodies. When we look at blood pressure, when we look at heart issues, when we look at obesity, when we look at sleep, I mean, every single medical issue. In fact, I just read an article that said being Black should be its own pre-existing condition, right? And so it's not just what's happening to Black skin as we talk about historical oppression, but what's also happening beneath Black skin that's connected to that chronic stress and chronic trauma that we had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, if I could, I want to jump right in on that, because she said a whole bunch of stuff that was just all noteworthy, right? But one thing that just stuck out of my mind that was glaring to me as she was speaking, just in terms of this idea of historical racism. Obviously, as a 31-year-old Black man, I was not living or in existence when our ancestors were brought over here forcibly against their will and, brutalized and embattered and everything else like that. But one thing that jumps out to me that is just as alive today in 2020 as it was all those years ago is this, small four-letter word that is so powerful, and that is fear. Fear, right? And one of the reasons why what Dr. Wright was saying is so important is because when I was looking at George Floyd and I was seeing all over the news, on every news outlet, right, the knee on his neck, I know without a shadow of a doubt that from my personal experience, I've never at this point in my life been on the ground with a cop's knee on my neck. But just the reality that it could happen sends shock waves of fear throughout me mentally and throughout me physically, so that it's almost like it has happened to me. And it's so interesting, and even resilient. I feel that Black people are the most resilient people in all of the world. I just feel that, because the fear and shame, right, in our history that has been passed down and that we have been forced to live with, but have pressed through in the midst of it. It is just amazing and miraculous. But this idea of fear that has been passed down from generation to generation, even though I might not have experienced what my great grandfather did, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that fear also gets passed down. And we can see it even in those conversations that Dr. Wright was talking about, when we have to, in 2020, sit down with our sons, sit down with our daughters and have that talk. I can guarantee you white parents aren't sitting their white sons and white daughters down and having that talk about what happens when a police officer pulls you over. Like, we have to literally have that talk, not because in every home, in every Black home, it has happened, but just because of the reality that it could happen.
I think another important thing that Dr. Tiffany hit on it, and what the pastor just alluded to, and what is being passed down. And in my field, in the forensic side of what I do, it's really important, because we did not ask to be brought here. That's one thing. But let me tell you what has happened with these systems that Dr. Tiffany referred to, the system of slavery. Every time a system in the United States has been overthrown, it is not until they've replaced it with a new system to control us. And so slavery was overthrown, but it was replaced by Jim Crow. Jim Crow was overthrown, but it was replaced by mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is about to be overthrown, and you can best believe they already have another system in place waiting for us when mass incarceration is overthrown. So each time human beings, and generally it's not just us by itself, generally it is us with the dominant culture, all of us together. If you think about the history of America, when one of these racialized, traumatic systems that controls people of color is moved down, they move one into place. And so when people talk about police brutality doesn't exist, that's because they don't have an experience of Black and brown people in the United States of America. And what we understand is, and if you look at what's going on in Nigeria with the protests against police brutality, we can certainly see that it's not just color, it's not just racism, it's also a system. The police system of control can happen with brown people on brown people and Black people on Black people, just because of that barrier of the blue, that color, that uniform. And so we should wake up, people, and not just look at this as simply a racial issue. Certainly it is in America. But anytime you have a system of control that uses violence and intimidation to control its citizens, that is pervasive. And that's not just in America. That's the world over. And we have evidence of that in Nigeria, that it's the way you police, it's the way you control, it's those things. It's no longer a protect and serve in many places. And so when we think about all this trauma and how it's passed down, think about the people that Pastor is talking about that may not have ever experienced police brutality, may not have ever experienced racism the way we understand it. My 15-year-old son has never experienced it, right? Yet he comes to me and asks me, why do they hate us, Daddy? Why do they hate us? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, now this is a teachable moment. Let me first calm myself down so I can give my son a reasonable explanation, but it can't be intellectual. It's got to be a real conversation, right? First, who is they? Let's break this thing down, son. Who are you talking about? I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the bottom line is, to Pastor's point, he has a fear that he didn't have before. He grew up he grew up coddled. He grew up, he didn't ever experience this. And because of what he sees on his phone, because he didn't have to watch TV, and being inundated, being shown on every channel, having access. And that's the thing we need to understand about our young people. They have access to all the information we have and more. And so we have to be truthful with our young people, because they have all the information right here. And so when I answer that question for my son, I have to let him know, without making it just about us, I have to let him know, what are these systemic issues? What are the macro and microaggressions to pay attention to? And so the teachable moment turned into a bonding situation where I could let him know, but son, you don't have to fear, and then that's when you bring in that spiritual core and all those things. And I'm probably getting ahead of ourselves in terms of solutions, But what Dr. Tiffany said about that vicarious trauma is just resonating. And then you connect that to what Pastor is saying about the fear and how these things are being passed down. My mind immediately goes to our babies. It immediately goes to our children to say, how do we help them navigate this situation where everything seems like they don't have the problem? And then they see all this on TV or on their phone and recognize, wow, there is a problem. That's a conversation we should be having with our young people.
Sure. And we see the impact of intergenerational or transgenerational trauma being passed down, right? But what does that then look like? Like, in a real sense, do you feel that Black families raise generations based off ideologies rooted in trauma? Like, I came across an article the other day that was talking about that philosophies that were originated in slavery days. This idea that Black people have to work twice as hard as everyone else in order to get a shot. The fact that Black parents didn't typically celebrate their children's achievements, and they linked the lack of celebration of children's achievements publicly to the fact that if a child in slavery days was seen to be intelligent or seemed to have extraordinary gifts, they were oftentimes sold. And so it was a protective mechanism to sort of shrink your children so that they didn't celebrate their gifts. So how do you all think that sort of applies? Do you think we pass down traumatic mindsets and systems even through our stories or through our experiences or even through our behaviors?
Children developing through the various stages of development, they're influenced, yes, by their genetics, but they're also influenced by their environment. And part of the environment is that interaction within the family where stories get told. Grandma likes to tell stories about what happened in her time, and so on and so forth. So our children come in kind of knowing all these stories about slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights movement, all of that. And then they actually see, and as my colleague said, on their phones, they have everything. The information is readily there for them. So they're very much aware of it, even if they're not experiencing it in their actual day-to-day life. And so what I believe is happening is that we as a people are experiencing the effects, the psychological and physical effects of chronic stress. It's having its effect on our immune system, so that we are more likely to get certain diseases and disorders than other individuals are. It's having an effect on our mental health. And then because of our historical attitude or perspective, we're less likely to seek help or treatment. We're more likely to hide what's happening to us, and so we don't get the help that we need. So this generationally, yes, we're inheriting these attitudes, these beliefs about ourselves that are ingrained, and sometimes we don't even notice them until some event triggers this large discussion.
Yeah, one of the things that come to, wait, Dr. Tiffany.
Go ahead.
One of the things that come to my mind, and I agree with everything that Dr. Gordon said as well. I absolutely think that parents or families pass down, whether you want to call it information or pass down certain things based on ideologies that are birthed in trauma. But I think that it's due to exactly what you said, Dr. Defoe, which is in their minds, they are protecting the next generation of their family. Much like what Dr. Tiffany said, unfortunately, and I think whether it's due to mistrust in the mental health system or other systems in this country that have been designed to keep people of color down, many of our families historically have not had the information or even the wherewithal to be able to explain to generations the information, pass down the information that they need to be equipped to face this world in which we live. All of us would love to be fortunate enough to have parents like many of the panelists that are on here right now that can explain in terms that they can understand what's happening in the world, what we should be looking out for, so that you don't have to fear. A lot of the times I think that the fear tactic is used because I don't have any other words to adequately express to you what you need to look out for, or how you can be equipped to handle different things, the different systems that are out against you. And so then we turn to fear to hold our children in their place so that they know not to step out of line, so that they do shrink and stay under an umbrella, because if you get exposed and people see you, then something can happen to you. And so whether it is definitely unfortunate, but I don't think that our ancestors, moms and grandparents were doing that to lessen our value as much as I believe they were doing it just to protect us from a world that in their minds and in large part is proven is out to keep us down. I
think it's even demonstrated, for example, in the way that parents discipline their children. Historically, I know that there are a lot of changes right now, but historically, the idea that I've actually heard mothers say to me, "I'm gonna beat him so that the police don't get to beat him." So even something like that, they're not really trying to, their intention is not to abuse or to hurt. Actually, they're trying to protect their children from what they see that the larger society will do to them. And then that same society turns around and makes rules that, restricts those behaviors in a way that's punitive rather than redemptive.
Yeah, I mean, such great points being raised. And I mean, I certainly think it's happening consciously and subconsciously, right? In fact, I probably think more of it is more subconscious. It's just the survival mechanisms that we have adopted and had to adapt to. I mean, we're talking about people who have had to watch their husbands or wives or neighbors, community members be lynched, right? And if you dare raise up, then you were now at risk, right? We're talking about brothers and fathers and men having to watch their wives and daughters and sisters be raped in front of them and having to continuously suppress the emotions that comes up with as a protective factor, as a survival tactic. And so constantly, the functioning has always been contextualized within survival tactics, right? How can we just remain alive? How can we just survive in this country, in this state, in this even internationally, as Dr. Wright mentioned? And so I certainly do think some of it is subconscious. It's we embody this language of this is just who I am without really sitting and talking about. And this is one thing that I really am working with parents and even couples to do, sitting and talking about the impact of racism on you. How is it impacting you as a Black man, as a Black woman, as a Black child? Are we even understanding how it's showing up in ourselves, much less how it's showing up in our parenting, how it's showing up in our relationships, and how we communicate, and how we, just kind of, particularly for Black women and in those spaces that I'm in, this constant, just being the strong Black woman and having to constantly push through, and where all of these things that we think are just so natural and so normal, that's rooted deeply in many other things. And to not sound like a nerd, which I am a little bit of a nerd, but I like to bring into this conversation neuropsychology, especially as Pastor talks about fear. And so when we look at racial trauma, even on the brain, right? When we look at the amygdala and the hippocampus and all these different aspects of how it changes executive functioning, how it changes how we think, personality development, emotional regulation, how we respond, our memories, our learning. I mean, this thing is so layered, and we have to contextualize it in such a layered way so that we understand that we are not just operating. This thing is impacting us on every level, from the brain to the body, mentally, physically, spiritually, in every single way. And so when we're talking about families and children being socialized in families that have existed in these systems for generation, it must include all these different layers, from the brain work to the body work to behaviors to thoughts. It's very, very much interconnected.
Yeah, I would just add that, and I love the nerd. That gives me permission to be a nerd. But
I didn't know any of those words.
Dr. Defoe has opened up a can here, because let me tell you, when Pastor talked about the fear aspect, and then Dr. Tiffany takes us to the neuro. We all understand the ACEs study, right? That originally by Kaiser Permanente. A colleague of mine in Philadelphia, Dr. Roy Way. I mean, he's just a fabulous guy, number one. But he replicated that study in children in Philadelphia and found that children in Philadelphia have almost twice as many of the symptoms or the challenges from the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, as the original study, that group that was done on. We're not just talking about the physical abuse or sexual abuse or that kind of thing. He talked about the things that we're talking about today, the racialized trauma, what that looks like, and connected to what Pastor said with that fear is anger. Anger. Why are so many of our young people angry? If they didn't grow up, if they don't know the stories of great-great-grandma and all that, and they didn't experience any of that, why are our young people so angry? So it speaks to what Dr. Defoe has brought up to us today, and that's that intergenerational transference. That's that transference of these things, that changing the body chemistry, that changing the mental capacity that Dr. Tiffany is talking about is real when you look at the ACEs study. Trauma changes your brain chemistry. And so she didn't just make this up. This is real stuff. And it's important because when we have those conversations with our young people, and you're going to hear me all day talking about our young people, not that we shouldn't care about our middle-aged people, not that we shouldn't care about our elderly, we certainly should, but these are the people who are carrying us to the next level. These are the people that we currently are depending on, is those babies that I call them. We have to help them understand that there are resources and that there are ways to channel the anger, to deal with the fear, as Pastor talked about. We have a way to get you past the fear. Many of the people on this call right now can help people get past the fear. And so in our communities, we have resources and we need to really access them. And so disparities in access to healthcare is not just about not having enough providers. Sometimes, as my colleague said earlier, it's about us going the opposite way. We don't go to the dentist until we can't chew on both sides of our mouth. Okay. We're not going to get that checkup because we're afraid that the doctor, she might find something. Right. And so we don't go. All of those things are real for our community. But that fear connected to anger. And when you see people on TV knocking stuff down, burning stuff down, I understand that none of us want that. I understand that we look at that and some of us are going, oh, here we go again. Right. Because white people don't have to worry about, oh, I hope whoever committed that crime, I hope he ain't black. Oh, I hope he ain't. They don't have to think about that. They don't have to look at the news and be, oh, I wish they wouldn't tear down. I wish they wouldn't burn and all that, because they're not being judged on the same level. And so what I tell our young people who are angry is there are different ways to channel that anger. And protest, the Martin Luther King way is one way, the nonviolence, right? That's one way. And then you have what other people advocated for, which is, let's just storm the Bastille, so to speak. But I think everything that I'm hearing today tells me that we have messages for our young people of support. You don't have to be afraid. There's another way to channel that emotion. You don't have to be angry. There's another way to channel that emotion. And I'm not suggesting that you not feel what naturally comes up for you. What I'm suggesting is we have resources to help you make it through, right? And that whole thing about surviving, we need to move past surviving and get into thriving. And we can't just stay at surviving. Yeah. Black and brown people need to move past surviving. We're pretty good at that. Pastor indicated that. We're pretty good at surviving. We need to move past surviving and really embrace thriving. And for me, that's how we train our young people. Not to fear, not to ignore their emotions, but to move to the next level beyond them. Acknowledge it, acknowledge where it's coming from, and then access people in the community that look like them, that have similar experiences, that can walk them through getting out of that and getting through the other side. We're all going to go through something, but that indicates to me that there's another side. That means we're coming out of something. And to me, that is what we're all saying today is let's give our young people an opportunity to have a legitimate, authentic feeling of what it is. Name it, acknowledge it, give them the language for it, and then help them move to the next level with it.
So I think you opened up a can of worms there that I think we're going to jump headlong into before we sort of transition to helping people go through how do we now deal with it? How do we now cope? How do we now develop the language so that we can deal with it? But you mentioned something about access to healthcare and then also us not accessing healthcare. So it not being available to us and then us not accessing it, period. And I think that there's a linkage between this and our historical trauma. When you think of, them talking about a COVID-19 vaccine and then asking Black people to take it or testing it in the motherland. You think about something like the Tuskegee experiment and syphilis that was, so generationally, we've been passed down this mindset. But how do we break out of that so that we can access the appropriate, not only healthcare, we're not talking about medical stuff, but how do we access the psychological care, the emotional care that we need if we have this lack of this desire to not access healthcare? Like, how do we deal with that? How do we recognize it as trauma and then push through it?
Yeah, I think part of it is being able to be educated on, which is what Dr. Wright was talking about, and then taking advantage of institutions that we have that have been set up similar to what you, Dr. Defoe, have set up. You set up your own private practice to be able to be a blessing and an asset.
Nathaniel, this is my day job, man. Don't talk about my side job at my day job, man. Stop that. Now go on.
I mean, I'll talk about the other Dr. Defoe. But I'm a huge advocate for not just obviously therapy and mental health, but even more so than that, taking advantage of those avenues with people that look like you, who have a shared experience to what you've gone through. Who can resonate with your personal experience. I think that goes a long way in helping to kind of do away with the mistrust that is very founded that we have, not just in the health system, but also in the mental health system. And I think a lot of this we could even trace to back to slavery. We talked about that as well. When you look at this idea of taking the bodies and the strength of Black men and Black women, but pretty much crippling their minds. So you have access to the strength that is their bodies, but you have diminished the impact and the importance of their mind. And when you look at from generation to generation to generation, now even up to today in our community, we have this huge emphasis on being strong, right? Being physically strong, carrying loads, even if it's too much for you to carry, bend but don't break, being resilient, pushing through, not asking for help because you don't want to be looked at as being weak, right? And so we've even in ourselves, in our own community, have taken on this almost slavery-like mindset that as long as you can show people that you are strong, then it really doesn't matter if you're mentally weak. And I think that now we're seeing that, no, you need both. I don't think you can be physically strong if you're mentally weak. And I think that for our Black men and for our Black women, it's important that we're able to marry the two. You can't push through everything, whether you're man or woman. You can't bear everything. You weren't made to, right? But we have now access to the people who look like us, like the panelists who are here. I've never, been around so many doctors in my life on one panel. This is awesome. But we have access to so many avenues of people who look like us, men and women who have gone through the educational system, who have gone through experiences, who can now lend that helping hand to people who look like us, that to kind of help disparage those views and mistrust concerning the mental health system.
Those of us who have had the opportunity to study and learn and be exposed to as much as we've been exposed to, we have a responsibility to our community to actually provide information. Sometimes, there's a tendency to hold on to information as if that kind of creates a special class of people because we're in the know. I'm one of those who firmly believe that whatever knowledge and experience that I've gained, it needs to be fed back to the community. People will not get stronger than as much as they know. So therefore, we need to provide them with information, factual information, with while at the same time respecting the culture and the history. So we're not going to try to force a whole new system of beliefs on people, but we're going to work within that system of beliefs to actually bring about change based on knowledge.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think education is such a key piece here, while also speaking to the realities of these fears, right? Every single system in our society has disproportionately taken advantage of our people, whether we're looking at healthcare in many different ways within the healthcare system, or even within our own mental health field when we're talking about the psychological impact and mental health, even within our own field. Our people have been dehumanized by our early psychologists or early anthropologists. Even when we read the book, even The Rat Was White talked about how from the very inception, many of these theories that we utilize in clinical practice within themselves have inherent bias. And so we have to do a lot of unlearning, whether we are clinicians of color or not. And I think that's one of my favorite parts is the training piece and the consulting work that I do. Because even as Dr. Wright mentioned, the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Events Score Sheet, that highlights every other type of abuse or every other type of trauma, but racialized trauma is nowhere represented, right? Even in many of the assessment tools that we utilize. So our people have a reason to be distrusting, right? Distrustful. When they come into spaces and they do not see themselves, their identity, their humanities are not reflected in our assessment tools and our theories and how we engage and talk and speak to their experiences, then that further deepens the distrust. And so we have to really employ education and creating materials that speak to our people and speak to our experiences. And I really, really always like to encourage clinicians of color to create. We will not find what we need to heal our people in systems that continue to devalue us, that has always stripped us from our humanity. And so if we are going to rehumanize, or like Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about the vacant esteem aspect of post-traumatic slave syndrome, if we are going to build the esteem and identity and healing of our people, we must begin to create structures and tools that speak to those experiences. And so I certainly do see that as a part of the work that will be coupled with the educational piece and partnering with all of our disciplines across, whether we're talking about schools or hospitals. I know Dr. Wright talked about even working with clergy or all these different community individuals. We have to get in there and on the ground and really help people to rehumanize our people across every system, from the classroom to the institutions and organizations.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree 100%. And one thing I would add is part of that partnership. And the reason I think it's important for mental health professionals, behavioral health professionals, clergy, and academicians to partner together is because of the stigma that Pastor Drew talked about, not wanting to admit that something's wrong, trying to put on that brave face. A lot of times people of color will access their faith community first. When you look at the data, and you look at Harold Koenig out of Duke University, the work that he's done in terms of faith and how faith and spirituality really supports good health, not just good mental health, but also good physical health. One of those things that is looked at is how people of color they're not going to go to the psychiatrist or the psychologist first, because of the things that Pastor Drew mentioned, right? The things, Dr. Defoe, that you mentioned, the Tuskegee experiments, all those things, we remember those things. If we don't remember, we have some elderly person in our family who's going to remind us of what's going on and why they fear going to the hospital. And so we have to take advantage of what Dr. Gordon said. We have to meet people where they are. I can't come into your culture, your environment, your family, and tell you how to behave or what you should do. What I can do is work within your belief system and then help you get to that next point of choosing healthy alternatives. Because if the first thing you're going to do is go to your clergy, then I need to make sure that the clergy is educated. I need to make sure the clergy is trained. I need to make sure the clergy knows that she is not by herself. Hey, I'm over here. I got your back, right? And I want the clergy to reach out to me when somebody comes in that's beyond their training, and not just lay hands on people. No, I tell people all the time, pray without ceasing. And take your medication. Okay. We don't tell people to go, not to go to the cardiologist and just pray about it. We go to the cardiologist and pray, right? Go to the internal medicine physician and pray. Go to Dr. Tiffany and pray. So to me, if you have people who don't quite trust the health system, okay, let's work with them where they are. And so that's why it's so important, I think, to partner with clergy, because brown and black people trust them first, right? And so there is a responsibility for us as mental health professionals to have a working relationship with the people in the community that our citizens, that our people are going to trust first. And I will take it personal that they don't want to come see the psychologist, right? They want to go see Pastor Drew. All right. So me and Pastor Drew need to have a relationship so he can say, hey, Doc, hey, man, somebody came in my office today and I think this might be one for you, or let's do this thing together. And then I have to be professional enough to say to Dr. Drew, to say to Pastor Drew, hey, Pastor, I have an individual who wants a Christian psychologist, which that's fine, but they have some really serious spiritual concerns that I don't feel qualified to handle. Can we talk about this? And of course, we have make sure we have all the permissions and confidentiality, all that together. But it is a partnership so that people of color in the community know that they have supports across the board. And if they are a little squeamish about going to a physician or a psychologist or a social worker, that's okay. Let's meet them where they are. Let's get them to where they need to be. Because at the end of the day, Black people from our African heritage believe in that holistic mind, body, spirit together. It's holistic. You can't have good physical health without good mental health. And you can't have good mental health without good physical health. And the core of that is good spiritual health, that core connection, that holistic thing. That's what Black and brown people believe in. And so even though we've been fragmented, we've been tortured, we've been all those things, we have never lost our ability to see that we are stronger when we are totally healthy together across the board. And that's why this panel is so important, because of the disciplines that you've brought together. And that's why I think when we educate, we can't just educate, we also have to demonstrate. It's about teaching, explaining, demonstrating. That's how people remember lessons. And I know all you guys teach somewhere. That's especially with adult learning. Teaching, explaining, demonstrating. That lesson is going to stay a lot longer than if we just throw information at people. And so I appreciate what Dr. Gordon said. Meet people where they are. Don't try to change their belief system. Meet them where they are, and let's walk them through it at whatever pace they're comfortable. Because at the end of the day, our goal is health and wellness.
So we're going to take questions pretty soon. So if you do have questions and you are watching, then just drop your questions into the question box, and we'll take your questions fairly soon. But what I want us to talk about is I want us to help individuals who are suffering and struggling with racialized trauma or any type of trauma right now. Like, how do we provide them with some coping mechanisms or some resiliency points to help them right now, not from organizational standpoint, but from a personal standpoint. And then I want us to take up this conversation of racialized trauma in our church. We're going to take questions, and then we're going to be done. So how do we offer people immediate coping mechanisms for dealing with racial trauma and also trauma in their individual lives? I just had someone tell me the other day, David, I don't know what life looks like without my pain. And it blew me away. Wow. Because I was like, geez. And of course I begged and pleaded to ask permission to be able to tell people that is where people are. And for some people, even with historical and racialized trauma, they're in that same spot. So what coping mechanisms can we offer, and what path to resiliency can we provide?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing I would say, I'll just jump in and I'll let the experts give the rest. One thing that I know has been a major blessing to me has been community, right? And I know that we've all been in spaces where, whether it's the barbershop with the boys, the beautician shop with the girls, whatever it is, on the court playing ball, where you're just with like-minded people who have similar experiences to you. And you just get around, in a leisure way, and you're just talking. And I know for me, there has been so much healing that has come from me just being around my boys and sharing with them, maybe personal things that have happened to me, things that have that I've been fearful of. If I've been stopped by the cops and I was scared for my life, and whatever the issue might be, just being around people and in community, being able to be heard, being able to listen to. You'd be amazed at how much healing is just in getting some things off your chest, off your shoulders, off your mind, and just talking, right? And having that. And it's not a therapy session. It's just having community with people, that you're friends with and that you care about. And so one practical, very simple thing is, use your community, the people who you confide in the most. Build a community around you. Do something that can help you to de-stress. For me, one of the ways in which I de-stress the most is playing basketball, and my preference is obviously as a pastor, is to be in settings where I can play basketball, because I'm always around Adventists or people who believe like I believe. And so for maybe if it's one side of the week or twice out of the week, I like to be in environments where there are no other Adventists, right? Where nobody knows me as Pastor Nathaniel Drew. They just know that's Nate that comes and plays ball with us, right? And I like being in those kinds of settings because I get to be myself without being a pastor, without being a therapist, without any level of education. I'm just one of the boys hanging out with the other guys. And for me, there's healing in that. I get to de-stress. I get to come away from pressure. So that's one thing that I would offer as a coping mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some coping mechanisms that I usually teach are around, specific to racial trauma. Settling is a huge piece of the healing aspect, right? And so I like to help people identify, what do you feel like when you feel well, as kind of a baseline. A lot of us have not really thought about what we're like when we're at our best. What's happening in our environment? Who are the people that typically help us to feel well, or are around when we feel well, so that when you are triggered and your anxiety or stress or depression becomes heightened, you're aware of where well is, so that we know what we're working back to. And identifying specifically what aspects of racism or racialized violence is triggering you. Let's get very specific. So I would encourage you to think about what exactly is triggering you. Is it police brutality? Is it you were pulled over by the police? Is it at your job and experiencing microaggressions? Is it within a particular classroom if you are a student? Where and what specifically is triggering you? And being aware of how, for example, anxiety shows up for you. So does it show up in the physical way, where you're starting to get headaches or pains? Does it show up emotionally, psychologically, behaviorally? And really being able to pinpoint what is happening, so that we know what we're moving towards, and utilizing really centering strategies. So what helps you feel centered in those moments? Is it speaking out and advocating and defending yourself? Is it being able to utilize exercise and movement and those releases that can help calm your body down, really using deep breathing in moments like that, especially if you are going to be watching the news often, or you watch a lot of these videos and things like that. All of that is going to really speed up your anxiety or your stress. And so bringing it back down and utilizing some of those deep breathing mechanisms, exercise mechanisms, doing body scans and being able to note where in your body the stress might be living can also be really, really helpful, so that if it's, for example, some people experience it in their shoulders. So just something as small as massaging that area to release that tension can help. Or going for a walk, fresh air, turning off social media, physical health, because like we talked about, all these things are connected. And so as we take care of our physical health, it gives us, an additional fight and chance. We need that. Like Pastor Nate mentioned, the community aspect of it. And so talking to other individuals about shared experiences. Do you feel afraid? Are you afraid for yourself? And so that is a huge stressor. And so talking to your trusted colleagues can help. I'll just also add this, specifically if you are a parent, and so there's fear for your child, really utilizing that racial socialization theory piece that just helps parents to talk about direct racial encounters with their children. A lot of parents are afraid of having these conversations, and so that stress also lives in their body, and the children are picking up on that as well. And so talking about it helps parents to give their children and even themselves some problem-solving ideas of, okay, if this happens to you, here's what you can do. If you get stopped by the police, here's what you can do. If you have a direct negative racial encounter at school with the teacher, here's what you can do. And so talking about it, really, we have seen also helps, because you're beginning to feel more competent to manage it. You're beginning to feel like, okay, I'm developing some skills here, and I'm not living in the fear of our racism and it's not hiding. And I think continuing to build cultural pride, that rehumanizing ourselves is important. There are strengths that we hold. There are great things about who we are and our people. There are so many stories about us, about our people, even before enslavement, that can help build that cultural pride, that all helps to, really build up our overall esteem around our anxiety, and really can be an affront to systems who attempt to define us. We kind of regaining that control and defining ourselves and our families and our goals for ourselves.
That is awesome. Listen, I think that Tiffany, having the founder of Adventists for Social Justice, helps us on this panel, because what you just talked about was just, it crossed just psychological stuff. It entered into some of even your social impact work that you're doing. So I want to thank you for that. Dr. Gordon or Dr. Wright, you got anything to share as far as coping or helping individuals deal with racialized trauma in the present?
One of the things that happens to people who have been suffering with chronic stress, chronic racial stress even, is that they eventually lose hope and get to a place where they feel helpless. And so I think that one strategy is helping individuals to change their self-talk about who they are and about what they're capable of, giving them control where they feel as if they have lost all control. So learning to take control of their own responses, their own attitudes, and their own decision making, I think is an important part, because once you change the way that the person is viewing themselves and others around them, then that can actually change, their whole outlook, give them a sense of hope, because hopelessness is what eventually destroys us when we've been suffering from chronic stress.
Yes, I agree 100%. And one thing that I would say is where you started, Dr. Defoe, when you mentioned the person that you got permission to share that they don't remember a time when they don't remember a time without their pain. And so one of the things, as I was listening to my fellow panelists, is it's important, and this is something that I use with many of my clients, is it's important for you to recognize when something has changed. When something has changed. Sometimes we don't know, and Dr. Tiffany hit on when she talked about the subconscious and may not be aware. And so sometimes it may be because somebody else is aware. And this is especially for parents. Pay attention to your young person when their behavior changes. Okay. And so you may not be as good at it doing it for yourself, recognizing what my triggers are. We talked about that earlier, but you may be able to recognize it in your children and have that conversation. The other reason to have this conversation with your children is because that practice of sharing with you and you asking them questions and them getting a chance to respond and share how they feel is good practice for them acquiring a voice. It's also important for them to understand that only they can tell their story. And so many times, Black and brown people, somebody else is telling our story, the media, and so now we have access to podcasts, we have access to, we don't have to wait on channel whatever to come tell us about our story. We can tell our own story. And so again, I'm always going to defer back to the young people. How do we help our young people recognize when they're stressed? How do we help our young people recognize when they're depressed or feeling anxious or are fearful or are angry? And it's, you have to be in touch with your own physical, psychological, spiritual makeup so that you know if you're sleeping more than you normally sleep. Are you sleeping less than you normally sleep? Are you eating more than you normally eat? Are you eating less than you normally eat? So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to go get a Ph.D. in this, right? We can help you understand how to get in touch with your mind, body, spirit, so that you recognize changes that are not like you. This is not like me. I'm not usually this belligerent. You know what? I'm a little impatient this week. What's going on with me? Why am I so short of temper? That is an example of paying attention to how you would normally behave. Something must be going on. Why am I snapping, right? Why am I stressed out on my way to work if I'm still going to work? Somebody mentioned about the supervisor at work or going to church. Why is it that I pull up to the church parking lot and I sit in the parking lot and I'm not sure if I want to go in, right? I remember talking to people that they had those experiences. And now that we're all on Zoom, are you not even checking in to that spiritual connection, that's available to you, right? And so to me, knowing your body, knowing your mind, knowing your spirit, that holistic piece helps us identify when we're a little bit off track. And again, if you don't notice it in yourself, you may not notice it in your children. And so we have to pay attention to when behavior changes. That might be the only red flag we have. We started this conversation with Dr. Gordon talking about, the emotional wound, the psychological wound. It's not the same as bumping your leg on a table and you see the bruise come, or having the cut on your hand and the scab forms. The psychological, emotional is invisible, right? So we have to pay attention to behavior. That's the red flag for us to see that psychological, emotional pain, because it's not so obvious as a physical injury. And if we can really kind of get in touch with our bodies, our mind, body, spirit, then we can know when those triggers are happening. We can identify it. We can have a language for it. And then that's empowering. And we must tell our own story.
Yeah. Listen, this was powerful, and I want to thank you all for that, for this conversation. Listen, we're going to have part 2. Because we have not yet addressed some of the things that I had on our question list. And so I warned you all when I sent you all this that we may have to have a follow-up discussion. We didn't even get to racialized trauma in the church. So the next one, if y'all commit to it, we're going to deal with that. But I want to take the questions because some of the questions are very good. But usually, we break for a little 30-second commercial. You all could sip some water, and then we'll come right back with our questions. And so, audience, if you have any questions that have not yet been submitted, submit them really quickly, and we'll see how many of them we can get to. So we'll be right back.
The Relationship Ministries Department of the Allegheny East Conference is a family of ministries that seeks to engage, enrich, and empower families, men, singles, couples, and parents to have healthy and whole relationships. To access the many resources we have available to you, your church, or your family, visit us on the web at www.visitaec.org/relationshipmin.
All right. So two of our panelists didn't know. They thought it would be a long commercial, a 3-minute. Anyway, so this question is a good one for. This question is actually a good one for you, Dr. Wright, because it talks about incarceration. One of the things that you do. This comes from Dr. Hickman. She says, "Question: Does the intergenerational transference of incarceration discuss the intergenerational?" I can't even pronounce these words. Transference of incarceration from parent to child and grandchildren.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Dr. Fisher Hickman. And what I would say is that we have ample evidence of that. And I'll just speak to Philadelphia, where I am. Before COVID, I went inside the prison probably 2 or 3 times a month. And there's several prisons that most Philadelphians are in. Obviously, Philadelphia is the 5th largest city in the nation. So we have quite a bit of people. And so in those 2 prisons, I have seen, and it's not uncommon, to have 3 generations, to have a grandfather, a father, and a son, sometimes in the same block. So that's real. In terms of all the things we've said before this program today, at the beginning of this program, you can pass down behavior, you can pass down attitude, you can pass down, certainly you can pass down physical attributes, right? So certainly a mindset is something you can pass down. People have talked about intergenerational transference of how one handles money, being on assistance for 3 generations, what that looks like, and who's going to be the one to break the chain, so to speak. And so specific to incarceration, yes, it happens quite a bit. And I've talked to young men who some of them think it's a street cred or a badge of honor. Some people think it's actually, believe it or not, it's that movement into manhood, right? In some communities they have the bar mitzvah. In other communities they have the seglaria. In some communities they have what is it that African Americans, what is their signal or their sign, that they are now reaching a certain level of maturity. And unfortunately, brothers and sisters, for many of our young people, especially in those communities where they may have a parent or 2 incarcerated, that's what it is. It's you didn't really make it until you have that badge of courage where you are also joining in. And that is a very dangerous mindset, because you don't want to be in a situation where your destiny, you believe with all your heart, your destiny is either death or prison. That is a realistic mindset for many of our young people. And when you're out there, I'll give you an example. Many of them, I used to be an old head, right? I used to be an old head. Now they call people like me Unc. The old heads are 24 to 30-year-olds. They're, Pastor Drew's an old head now because of the youth on the corner, 16, 15, 14, 18. They see Pastor Drew as the old head. I'm not the old head. I'm not even considered anymore. I'm Unc. It's the 30-year-olds, it's the 25 and 20 and 30-year-olds that these young people look up to. And so if they're on the corner, on the block, that's the old head. That's who they're trying to model their behavior. And so that transition from boyhood to manhood, we have to remove that sense that incarceration is something to be looking forward to, or worse, it is something that's inevitable and part of my destiny.
Sure. Okay, so here's another one. And anyone who wants to tackle this. Can we talk about the narcissism, gaslighting, and stonewalling by African, West Indian, and African American parents? How to deal with the effects and stand up for oneself and break the cycle. Ooh. Anyone who has courage. I do not. So anyone who has courage, go right on ahead.
Ooh, that's heavy. I get this question often just because I work at a university and I work with a lot of college students who are in these two gaps with themselves and their parents. I'm not so much going to speak to the parenting side of it. What I would say and what I share with my students is, when we talk about all these things that we have talked about, right? Like, it's not just how it's impacting us, but how it's also impacted previous generations. This thing is intergenerational. And when we look at these large conversations that we are having around self-awareness and mental health, these are all really new conversations, right? Like, we are moving so much towards the destigmatization and to understanding ourselves in such a much more beautiful way that will help us hopefully do better with generations to come. And so I do think that, previous generations, with some boundaries and some limits, because if there is, abuse or things like that, that's a different conversation. But there is a lack of education and a lack of understanding that many previous generations have not been given the resources like we have had to really dig into and understand on a different level. I mean, if I go talk to my mom or my grandparent about gaslighting, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what that term means. So we are in such a different context with this conversation. And so I think what I encourage my generation to do is to acknowledge the effects on you and decide for yourself how you want to change the course of your life and the course of the generations to come. Because there will be an exhaustion trying to get the previous generations to come along, and so a part of that conversation is also boundaries. What boundaries might you need to set even within your own family, set even with your own parents? There might be boundaries that you have to set for your own emotional well-being. And so that can become a challenging conversation. And it does take some independence and it does take some courage, specifically dependent on certain cultures. But I don't know that we are going to pull the older generations into this work that many of us are digging into today to change the course of things for the generations to come.
Interesting. As a West Indian parent myself who belongs to the older generation, I find the question interesting. And one of the things that I really encourage within our churches is open dialogue. I don't believe that we're going to change everybody and everything, but having open dialogue between the generations, because there is a difference in terms of folks who migrated here to the United States when they were children, they have a different worldview. Folks who migrated later in life when their worldview was pretty much set, they're not going to change a whole lot of things. But the fact of the matter is that we need to keep our families intact. And so in order to help to keep our families intact, we have to find creative ways of communicating with each other. And so I think that our churches are our prime place that we can create safe spaces for dialogue between the generations and between the individuals who are at different levels of acculturation. And you know, sometimes too, I find that the younger generation kind of tends to look for the older generation to create the change. But I think that the younger generation, with their innovativeness, with their open-mindedness, and with their creativity, can actually help to create those safe spaces that would allow meaningful, purposeful, and productive dialogue between individuals.
Oh, and they're doing it. They're doing it. Nathaniel, Nate, this is a question for you, man. You tackle this one. It's long. My question is, do we see a reason and need for mental health professionals to be assigned to every Adventist church for grief, for childhood trauma issues, and to detect some of the individuals walking into our churches, looking at triggers, or at least educating the church leaders of what to look for in mental episodes? These things are essential nowadays. Do you see a need for a mental health professional in every Adventist church? And then the rest got cut off, but I think that was enough to give you a good amount to deal with, Nate.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would give an emphatic yes to that question. I think that anything that we can do as a church to set ourselves up for greater health, greater wellness, and success in life, to where we can move from what Dr. Wright was talking about, which is that survival mode, to thriving. I think any way that we can actively engage in setting that up, we need to do it. I think it's been long overdue. I think now that we're still having this conversation, it can be a little disappointing, you know, that we kind of arriving so late in the game. But yes, absolutely. I think that that we as pastors, that there should be a level of training in terms of how to tap in to a certain degree. If you don't go all the way in the mental health route, at least have some kind of training to be able to be aware of certain traumatic experiences that people go through, to be able at least to help from a first standpoint to help out with what people are going through, but then also being having access to resources, community organizations, people, another thing that Dr. Wright was talking about, so that we can, be able to team people up, or at least pass them off, for less of a better term, for people who are qualified to handle those things. I think gone are the days where we can really just pray about it. And I don't think there was ever an appropriate time for just that, but especially now, where we see the emphasis on mental health being at an all-time high. Yes, there's a place for prayer, but we have to do so much more than that. I think if we can get to a point where we can have an actual qualified mental health professional in every church, I think we will see the health of our members sky high. Like it would be an enormous improvement to have that aid. So I would absolutely say yes.
Yeah.
To add to that really
quickly.
To add to that really quickly, Dr. Defoe, I think why it's so critical as well, a lot of pastors don't think about sermons being triggering, but they are. Pastors get up and they preach about everything under the sun. They utilize stories and examples and people's lived experiences within sermons to make connections to scripture. And so when you get up on the pulpit and you uncover lived experiences in such a way without thinking about the impact and ensuring that there are resources to now deal with the triggering that's happening in the pulpit, to not do that is dangerous. To not do that is irresponsible. And so we have to look at wellness, and we have to look at our churches overall as a place where triggering happens week by week. And so how do we create interventions so that people do not just have raw emotions or raw realities relived in the pulpit, and they have to go home and figure it out on their own?
Yeah. And to that point, very, very quickly, because I've seen it. I'm just going to be honest. I've done it and had to learn from the error of my ways, where it's not just certain sermons. Because Dr. Tiffany is absolutely right as it pertains to sermons. But pastors, we have even done things like have mental health emphasis weekends where we bring in speakers and we have whole weekends where we are uncovering trauma, right? That's really what we're doing. And really we relegate it to that weekend. We promote it. We have flyers. We bring people out in the community and we bring in these excellent presenters and speakers, and they have their PowerPoint presentation. They do their ACE trainings, all these different things. And we uncover all of these wounds. And then once the event is over, we go back to business as usual. But these people now are uncovered, they're exposed, and they have no idea what to do. So what you're saying is absolutely true.
Absolutely. Yeah, listen, that was, and I think there's some people out there, I'm going to come to you right quickly, Dr. Wright.
Okay.
There's some people out here who need to hear that. Don't open up what you can't fix or provide salve for. We leave people with open wounds and we don't get to ever bandaging. And that's malpractice.
Yes.
If you were a surgeon, they would take your license. Anyhow, Dr. Wright. Yeah,
Well,
and then we have to close.
First of all, kudos to Dr. Tiffany for having the discussion on the impact of trauma in the community of faith anyway.
Sorry.
She's not waiting till next time. She's like, no, I'm going to hit this right now. So I appreciate that. That's real. What I was going to respond to Pastor Drew is you are absolutely right. That's why I spend so much of my time working with clergy because clergy are open to it now. Right, doing a lot of things. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I'm doing a lot of things with the NAD to really bring mental health as part of the Adventist health message. We do a great job with what to eat and what not to eat, and what to drink and what not to drink, but we don't do a whole lot on the behavioral health. That's changing right now, even while we speak. That's changing. So to your point, Pastor Drew, that's going to happen. The other thing is we can bring training to pastors. It's something called mental health first aid, which I know the NAD is going to roll out at some point. I'm a certified mental health first aid trainer in a lot of different of the capacities. We can make that happen for you. It doesn't turn you into a mental health professional. It teaches you the signs and symptoms of behavioral health challenges, which includes mental illness, substance abuse, that kind of thing. And the final thing I will say is we may not even be aware of how many mental health professionals are in the congregation. Okay, so I'm working on a project right now where I'm actually compiling that information so that people will know who's available to them. Now, it doesn't mean you want to see somebody in the pew sitting next to you, but you do need to know that there are people in the neighborhood. You know, people call me from Cleveland, Ohio, and say, "Hey, you know, can you service me?" And I'm like, "Well, I live in Philadelphia. Let me check and see what's going on in Cleveland, and I can make a referral." Right? That's the kind of thing. But most people want a referral from a Christian, and so they're like, "Okay, And so I need to know of how many Adventist churches are in Cleveland. Just using Cleveland as an example. You know, how many therapists are in the neighborhood, so that if you don't want to go to a therapist that actually goes to the same church you do for confidentiality, all the stuff we talked about, then I should be able to refer somebody to a different place that they can access a Seventh-day Adventist Christian if that's what they want. I've also made referrals to people to just have a Christian therapist that may not be a Seventh-day Adventist, and people have accepted that because, again, they may feel some kind of way about being exposed by people, because the 6 degrees of separation in the Adventist church, some people may feel some kind of way about that. So you make a good suggestion, Pastor Drew. I am willing to partner with you and any other clergy that is under this call. Obviously, Dr. Defoe knows this, that this is I'm a preacher's kid. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart to make sure that we partner, not to come into somebody's church and tell them how to run it. No, I'm not qualified, but I am qualified to partner and say, "Hey, what are you seeing in your congregation that you need help with? You know, Dr. Tiffany and I, we're going to be there, in November, we're going to do such and such. We got it, right? And as soon as this COVID thing's open, we'll start doing it in person. But right now we have resources to help our clergy. We have resources."
Yeah. And you mentioned something very impactful, the mental health first aid program. The department has offered the mental health first aid program to churches for free for like the last 3 years. And so we've been doing it. We've probably done maybe about 4 in different churches. COVID, we had 6 on the schedule this year, but I need more instructors. And so it's good to hear that you're an instructor. And if there are people that are listening that are in the conference that are mental health professionals or even not, that want help to become an instructor, we'll help you because we did have an ambitious goal to make sure that there's at least a mental health first aid person trained in each of one of our churches. And so that's something that we definitely need help to do. And I'm glad you're working with NAD to sort of make that a reality, because it's something that we have traditionally ignored. But we are going to come back with part 2, hopefully, if you all come back. Tiffany did start trouble by bringing up church stuff when we said we weren't going to do it, but we want to thank her for that, listen, I'm going to just advertise some things that are coming up this weekend and next weekend. And then I want you all to just leave people with one thing that you want them to take away from this conversation. So just think about it while I talk about things that are coming up in this next week. Tomorrow, we are having, the Relationship Ministries Department is having this family and finances discussion. We're talking about tools for securing the family in the middle of hard times. And so we have Elder Joseph, Sister Esmond, Dr. Levy, and Dr. Hatcher. They're coming to discuss with us for family and finances, ways that we can help secure our families financially. On next Saturday, we're having this conversation. I was gonna put it off, but I was talked into doing it anyway. We're gonna have this conversation on sex and sexuality, what the church won't tell you but really should. We have Dr. Davis, Dr. Carmen Robinson, Dr. O'Rourke, Dr. D. Knight, and myself will be having this conversation, sex and sexuality. We put on there that it's for mature audiences only, but it won't get too out of pocket. We're going to discuss biblical sexuality. And so if you don't want to have conversations with your teenagers, put them in front of the broadcast and we'll do it for you. And then on next Sunday, we are continuing our Sunday conversation series with Dr. Anthony and India Medley, the senior pastor and first lady of the Emmanuel Brinklow Church. And so join us for Sunday conversations on next Sunday as well. All right. So just give everybody one thing that you want them to take away from this conversation. Whoever wants to go first, we'll go first, and then we'll start. Dr. Gordon, could you go first if you don't mind? And then we'll go around in a circle if you all don't mind.
Okay, I would say that trauma, racial trauma, is something that affects most Black persons directly or indirectly. And we may not be able to change the circumstances of the trauma all the time, but we definitely always have the freedom and the opportunity to choose our attitude towards the situation and to seek the help that we might need to help us to get through the situation. So we have the freedom to choose our attitude. We have the freedom to make appropriate choices in terms of how we get help. And we have the personal responsibility for self-care.
That me next, okay. So one thing that I would say is as has been mentioned already, that we're constantly bombarded with different triggers for trauma that we might face, whether it's racial, familial, or something else. One thing that I would just emphasize, Dr. Gordon did towards the end, is self-care, prioritizing, not allowing it to fall to chance, but prioritizing moments where we can step away from the news, step away from social media, step away from everything, and just have some moments of intentional self-care, whether it's getting a massage, whether it's engaging in some kind of physical activity, whether it's having community and hanging out with your girls or with your boys, whatever it is, having some moments of prioritized self-care where you can step away from the triggers and just get a moment of reprieve.
Mm-hmm. So good. I think yeah, really good tips. I will just add, with post-traumatic experiences also comes post-traumatic growth. And that means that we are not despondent, we are not without hope, and we're certainly not without help to be able to move forward, not just individually, but as a community. And so I am praying that a lot of what we discussed today spoke to you in a really positive way and helps to build some of your hope, some of your positive thinking and positive hope for moving yourself and your communities forward, knowing that together we can certainly be able to heal ourselves and heal our communities.
Absolutely. And I would just share that when we're talking about trauma, the most important question is not what's wrong with you. That is a conversation stopper. The question is, what happened to you? And when you have asked that question, then we have an opportunity to really explore healing. And so it's important, especially for parents or caregivers or professionals, when they're talking to people who've been traumatized, to understand the correct question and to get that other question out of their brain, because that's a conversation stopper. The other thing is, in terms of finding strength in your struggle, we have to understand that there is no life, there is no time that will not be challenging. And so strength actually comes because of struggle. You actually find your strength in struggle. And so the suggestions that my colleagues have said today is very, very important, that we understand that it is fruitless to wish for a life without struggle. The goal is to find the strength so that you can move past it, move past surviving, move into thriving. And so that is the key, is to really understand that you have the tools, you have the ability, you have the support. What we have to do is access it and not be afraid. And it's okay to not be okay. You have support. We're here for you.
Awesome. Listen, I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart, Dr. Gordon, Pastor Drew, Dr. Llewelyn, Dr. Wright. I want to thank you all for this robust discussion. And I can't wait for part 2, where we can unpack this racialized trauma in the church. And hopefully you all, we can find a date where we can do that. For those of you who are struggling or who want to get access to the resources that we've provided for you, if you go onto the Relationship Ministries webpage, the address is there on the screen. You can access an amalgamation of mental health resources, family-related resources. There's resources for parenting. But what you'll also find on there is a clinical referral directory. We're still in the process of updating it, but we have a directory grouped by states where we have vetted clinicians and have also placed a key for you to determine if that clinician is Adventist, if they're Christian, if they take insurance, if they take children, if they do couples. You can go and you can access that clinical referral directory there on the website. I want to thank our panelists again. I want to thank you all for coming and for engaging in this discussion with us. And until next time, we'll hopefully see you tomorrow for family and finances, or maybe next week for sex and sexuality. Have a wonderful and blessed Sabbath.